because we did record the first one, which is one of the things I wanted to mention as I review the first part of this research project. I gave a presentation on October 10th during the adult education hour, and you can find that by going to the church website or the YouTube page, YouTube channel for Westminster. But just to briefly bring you up to speed by reviewing part one, if you weren't able to participate in the October 10th program. Westminster was founded in 1939 by Reverend Frederick Haverkamp. His picture is here. He was a Northern Presbyterian evangelist who was called by the presbytery to found this new church on the burgeoning west side of Alexandria, where lots of houses were being built as the Pentagon was getting ready to open. He was at Westminster for about 3 years, and then he went to found Trinity Arlington. There were 38 charter members from 12 states in DC, and they came from 4 different denominations. A little bit about the setting. This was a time in both Alexandria and the state of Virginia where the remnants of Jim Crow remained entrenched in daily life. There's some other interesting things that were happening in the city at the time that the church was formed that was part of my program on October 10th and is covered in the written document that's going to be available later this spring. And I'll a review of part one of my project. I did a deep dive into the work of Clifford Johnson, mainly through the sermons, which many survive in written form and almost all of them survive in audio tapes. But he was a young guy when he came from Leesburg to Alexandria. He had a very candid and direct preaching style. He would tell you in advance that you are not going to like what he had to say. And then he'd say it, and then he'd say again, you might not like what I had to say, but I felt it is my duty and obligation as your minister to tell you what I just told you. He was very grateful for what he called Westminster's freedom of the pulpit that was granted to him. His sermons included unequivocal support for school integration, open housing, and civil rights. And there was not any question about where he stood on those issues. He also very much predicted that that the legacy, that Westminster's legacy would matter. He was very concerned that the future generations know where he stood and where the church stood on the great issues of the day. It was kind of one of those hair, the hair on my arm sort of tingled when I would read some of the things he said about the legacy that future generations would come back and look and see what he said and what he did. He really did rely upon the example of Christ and his own understanding of the Christian faith to guide his evolution of his views on race. And he was very clear that his views were evolving on the issues of the day, and that he was very honest about needing God's help to counteract his own feelings of prejudice, which were deeply ingrained in him, having grown up in Georgia. Very tragically, he died of a brain tumor at the age of 53. In 1970, he had been at Westminster for about 25 years. So now I'm going to move to the next section of the manuscript, and the second half focuses on one particular member, Connie Ring, who really exemplifies the faith in action in our community that has been characteristic of our congregation from its beginning. And then the second half of tonight's presentation will look at how our congregation has evolved on matters of race over its 80-year history. And I just, before I delve into the material about Connie, I wanted to say that I have benefited greatly from conversations with Jane Ring, from Sarah Yancey, who was a member of Westminster in the 60s and 70s. She was known as Sarah Skidmore then. Also from Winky Campbell, who is the widow of Don Campbell. She's now in her 90s and living in North Carolina. And also from Dr. George Para, who lives here in Alexandria at Goodwin House. So Connie and his wife Jane, this is a young Connie here, were among those that were drawn to Westminster by Cliff Johnson's preaching. Connie was born into a family of public educators. His father was superintendent of schools in Jamestown, New York. His mother and sister were public school teachers, and his two brothers were involved in higher education. While he was in law school at Duke, he was a legal aid volunteer. He was going into poor areas of Durham to advise Black residents. This is a time when the Black neighborhoods of Durham did not even have paved roads. And as Jane says, this was an eye-opening experience for a kid from upstate New York. It was a time when he saw racial discrimination up close and personally. He moved to Alexandria with Jane in 1956, and he chaired the Alexandria Republican Party during the 1960s. The Republican Party was pretty small back then. In Alexandria, there were really two prevailing political forces in the city. One was the Byrd machine, the effort by Senator Harry Byrd, Democrat of Virginia, who was very opposed to integration and had very deep ties to City of Alexandria political leadership at that time. And then there was a smaller, more progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And Connie really was trying to find the middle ground between these two forces. Connie was definitely a champion of voting rights. In fact, he may have done more to improve voting rights in Alexandria than anybody else that I know of. At the time in the 50s, when Connie was registering to vote for the 1956 presidential election, only about 15% of Virginia residents were registered to vote. And when he went to register to vote, he was handed a blank sheet of paper, and he was expected at that time, mostly what was called blank sheet registration was used in southern states to deny Blacks the ability to register to vote. But in any case, he found himself on the other side of a blank sheet registration system where you needed to be literate and you needed to know the right questions to answer and to spell them correctly and have all of your I's dotted and T's crossed, or else you could be denied registration. So he sued the Board of Elections and was able to institute a standard form registration process, which was more equitable. He also worked to create more registration sites outside of city government buildings, reduce the residency requirement for registration, and also he worked to eliminate the state poll tax, although it took action by the federal government to sue the state in 1965 to abolish the poll tax. And this was after the 24th Amendment in 1962 had outlawed poll taxes. Virginia was one of 5 states that still maintained it even after the 24th Amendment passed. The federal government had to sue to get them to abolish it. And even as recently as 1975, Virginia ranked dead last among the states in the percentage of residents registered to vote. So It seems like we are still sadly fighting this battle today with voting rights across the country. Connie made a concerted effort to cultivate relationships with the city's Black leaders. And I've put a few pictures together of some of those. He and Jane hosted a monthly breakfast at their home with people such as Nelson Green, who's on the far left. Nelson was elected to city council at the same time as Connie. Another person who participated in these breakfasts was Ruby Tucker. She has a park named after her in the Lynn Haven neighborhood of Alexandria. Ferdinand Day is on the top right. He was appointed to the Alexandria School Board in 1964 and was the first Black school board chair in the state of Virginia. Below him is Melvin Miller, also served on the school board. Was a longtime advocate for affordable housing and a lawyer for the Department of Housing and Urban Development. In the middle on the bottom is a picture of Third Baptist Church on Princess Street in Old Town. The minister there in the 60s was a guy by the name of Reverend Joseph Penn. And he and Connie had a particularly strong relationship. Connie worked with him to put together a benefit concert that the two churches, the Third Baptist and Westminster, hosted together. It featured the Howard University Gospel Choir, which was just as nationally renowned then as it is today. They did national tours, and this concert raised $16,000 in today's dollars, funds that were used in a low-income section of town that Third Baptist was very involved in. And because this concert happened just weeks after Cliff Johnson died, the concert was dedicated to his memory. And I want to read you a paragraph from the concert bulletin, because I think it says a lot about what they hope to accomplish. And this is the quote: "Our two congregations have undertaken this joint effort as a living demonstration that two races can work together for constructive purposes on a full parity basis in this time when the world seems to be saying that that is no longer possible. We feel that this joint demonstration of unity is particularly essential at this time." And at this time, things were not great. Massive resistance was very much the order of the day in Alexandria, and specifically around the issue of school integration. When Connie was appointed to the school board, schools were still desegregated. The city was still run by elected officials who were part of the Byrd machine. And this is 15 years after the Brown versus Board of Education decision. Connie was adamantly opposed to the massive resistance that he saw that was present in Virginia and lots of places in Virginia, including Alexandria. He believed that public education was the great equalizer between racial and socioeconomic inequities. And at the time that he was living and working in the area, he had been hearing sermons from Cliff Johnson from as long ago as 1958 at that time, calling on the congregation to stand together and support an orderly transition toward integration. Cliff Johnson called school integration the most critical issue that the Christian church had faced since the Civil War. So 1969, Connie was the first Republican appointed to the school board, and racial tensions were very high. A young Black teenager had been shot inside a 7-Eleven, not all that far from the church, actually, by a white store manager, which set off some riots around town. And there were even white supremacist groups who were taking it upon themselves to patrol the city streets. So one of the first, sorry, I went too far ahead that time. One of the first things that Connie confronted as a member of the school board was school integration. And the school board adopted what was called the 6222 plan. It basically did not do anything to the existing elementary schools. So K through 6 schools remained as they were. And at that point, 6th grade was part of the elementary school system. There would be 2 junior highs for grades 7 and 8. 2 existing high schools would be converted to schools for 9th and 10th graders. And then all 11th and 12th graders would go to the new T.C. Williams High School. T.C. Williams being the name of the school superintendent who presided over schools during most of the massive resistance era. And he was a very ardent segregationist. So at this time, things were so tense around this plan that Connie and an assistant school superintendent named Richard Hills went to Hammond to escort Black students from the bus into the school in order to prevent white parents from throwing rocks at the Black students. It's hard for me to say those words because it's hard for me to imagine that in the city that I live in and that I love. But I have this from Jane Ring and from others actually who told me that independently. At the time, Hammond School had 2 Black students and no Black teachers. Nevertheless, the 6222 plan did not satisfy the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare's Civil Rights Director because it did not integrate the elementary schools. So that led to phase 2 of integration 2 years later, and busing of elementary students became the divisive issue in the city. But people also knew that if Alexandria did nothing, then they could be subjected to court-ordered busing, which could be an even worse outcome. So Connie offered a compromise plan that would pair elementary schools, a predominantly Black school with a predominantly white school, and students would attend one of the schools for the lower grades and the other school for the upper grades. This was very controversial. Jane said that they got very scary letters in their mail slot about this, but it did lay the groundwork for the final passage of a compromise. Connie actually voted against the final version that passed 5-4. He was concerned about white flight from the public schools. His version of the compromise would only affect 3,000 students instead of the 3,800 students that were ultimately affected. But the 3,000 students were largely the Black students. And so the folks who voted for the final version were concerned about the inequity of having the Black students bear most of the burden. So you can see here, this is just a summary of Connie's long record of public service, 10 years on the school board, 10 years on city council. He ran for mayor against Democrat Jim Moran and lost that election. Served on the Alexandria Redevelopment and Housing Authority for 11 years. And he was one of many Westminster members who devoted many hours and much leadership to the city of Alexandria. At one point in the 1980s, Chuck Beatley, who was the 5-term Democratic mayor, and Republican city council members Bob Calhoun and Connie were all Westminster members. And George Para jokingly describes keeping the peace across the aisle between them. But I think it shows the type of congregation that Westminster is, that there are people who do care deeply about the important issues in the community. And just to wrap up the section on Connie, Jane shared this lovely picture with me. Connie, of course, died last August. Patrick and I did have a chance to talk with Connie about this project once we were vaccinated last May, and that was very helpful. He was just as devoted to Westminster as he was to his community, and he served numerous terms on the session and on pastor nominating committees and many other capacities. And the church is a better place for his involvement in it. So next, I'd like to turn to sort of an overview of what the congregation was doing during this time as a congregation. For the first 3 decades, the congregation really was mostly focused on the consequences of being a fast-growing church. They were running out of space. They would build more space. They would finance more space. They would run out of space again, and they would plan for more construction and figure out how to raise money for that construction, and so forth and so on. Here's another picture of President Truman laying the cornerstone of the present sanctuary in 1952. And in terms of benevolences, or the money that the church was giving to causes outside of the church, these were mostly things that were organized through the Presbyterian denomination. There was an effort to try to increase pay for Black Presbyterian pastors. And there was also an effort to support Stillman College, which is an HBCU in Alabama. As part of my research on this, I've spent a great deal of time with a book by an author named Douglas Reed. He's going to be one of the speakers in the April series that's coming up, Sunday morning series. He wrote a book about the integration of Alexandria schools and sort of the federal government's role in integrating the schools in Alexandria as sort of an example of efforts that were happening in other parts of the country to integrate schools. And according to him, there was significant local support for racial moderation in Alexandria. It's a phrase that he uses several times in his book. And based on the messages from the pulpit that Cliff Johnson was delivering, and the packed pews, and the anecdotes that are buried in session minutes that I've been able to uncover from these years, paint a picture of a congregation that may have attracted what Douglas Reed refers to as these racial moderates. And I wanted to give you a couple of examples of why I think that might be the case. So in 1954, for instance, the session voted to employ a couple or a single person, regardless of color, to act as a caretaker and live in the church apartment. And indeed, they hired a Black man who lived in the church apartment. And the reason that this is noteworthy is because in those years, and even up until about 1970, homeowners in the neighborhoods around Westminster were prohibited from selling or renting to someone who was, quote, not of the Caucasian race. So this would have been, I think, a noteworthy vote on the part of the session to take this action. And similarly, in 1961, giving Dana Brown permission to allow a Black organ pupil to use the organ for practice. This would not have been a comfortable neighborhood for a Black person to live in a church apartment, or for a young Black organ student to come into the church to practice. So that made a bit of an impression on me. And then in 1962, apparently the session was responding to a query from a member about what the session would do if a Black person wanted to join the church. And they basically issued a statement that said that the church provide for no distinctions as to race as it pertains to church membership and worship, and also alluded to the fact that the policy that they're stating is no different from any policy they've had in the past. It's basically a continuation and a reaffirmation of the policy that they had already had. A couple of other events. There were some Westminster members who hosted out-of-town participants for the March on Washington. In 1963, there was a request for session to approve allowing the church to house visitors on the church property and the church facility, and that was not passed, but there were some members who individually hosted visitors. The session also approved a collection of contributions for the family of Reverend James Reeb, who was a Presbyterian minister who was killed in Selma. And a couple of other things. The youth group had a member of Shiloh Baptist as a guest teacher. Shiloh is one of the oldest Black churches in the city. It was founded by enslaved persons, formerly enslaved persons. In 1968, the session created these two new subcommittees, one on community concern and one on community relations. And one of those may have been the committee under which the benefit concert at Third Baptist Church in 1970 was held. So around the same time, 1968-69, there was an associate pastor named John Watkins, who actually just passed away right before Christmas. He lived at Sunnyside Presbyterian Home out in the Shenandoah Valley. He put together a committee of about 30 church members, and in his letter to those who were going to be part of this committee, he asked the question, how does a suburban church with its affluence and potential leadership relate effectively to the community in which it exists? That strikes me as a question that was asked 50 years ago, but could just as readily be asked today. He took that thought further and wrote a background document that was used when the committee first met. It was entitled Toward a New Perspective. And in this document, he makes the case that the first half of the 20th century, the church was focused on what he called inward activism. That is, doing things that bind the church members together, with softball leagues and bowling leagues and men's groups and women's groups and that square dancing nights and that sort of thing. And he really felt like that the next half of the 20th century, the church needed to be more directed outward. This committee came forward with a number of recommendations, including working with other local churches and synagogues to promote social change. Larry asked me a good question about whether we know if the session responded to these recommendations in any way, and I need to go back and look a little bit more closely and see if I can find out something along those lines. That's a good question. But we know that one thing that did come out of this group was something called the Northeast Ecumenical Parish, or NEEP, which is a group of 6 churches along the Upper Russell Road corridor. Their goal was to build a community center in the Lynn Haven area. It doesn't appear to me that this effort really got off the ground in any substantial way. I've really not been able to find out what actually happened to it. But a couple other things that were going on. that Westminster was involved in was an inner city camp at Camp Glenkirk, which was an old summer camp facility near Gainesville that the Presbytery used to own. There was this experimental ministry called Landmark Shopping Center Ministries, which was also a local presbytery effort. And the thought was that apartment dwellers on the West End were not interested in sort of traditional worship. And so they were going to provide childcare and art classes and consumer education and things like that. That was another endeavor that failed miserably and cost the presbytery a lot of money. But also there were lots of other things going on more locally. Alive, of course, which Westminster has been supporting ever since it was one of the founding churches for Alive, and some other groups. There was one called Fish, another called Fold, Bridge, Hopkins House, Meals on Wheels, Guest House. Those were all things that emerged during these years, and also that Westminster was involved in. And so after Cliff Johnson passed away, the church called Reverend Don Campbell, and he presided over a lot of this expansion of local mission activity in the 1970s. According to his widow, Winky, he did have similar views to Johnson on civil rights, but he was less forthright about his views from the pulpit. And sadly, there are no sermon texts available from Reverend Campbell because he didn't preach from a manuscript. He preached from an outline. So it does solve the mystery about why there are no, there's nothing in the archives with any of his sermons. He served from 1970 to 1979, and he also died tragically and prematurely at the age of 51 of a heart attack. And he was at Chautauqua vacationing at the time. He was succeeded by Dr. George Para, who served from 1980 to 1995. George said he didn't preach about race, but that he thought that his viewpoints were pretty widely known. He was an honorary co-chair of Bill Ewell's successful mayoral campaign. Bill Ewell was the first Black mayor of Alexandria. And he said he knows that Westminster members would see him out putting up yard signs for Bill Ewell. He also said that he called out racism whenever he saw it. And he told me a story of an elderly woman who was a member of the church who lived off of Quaker Lane, and she had a male nurse who would serve the night shift with her as a home health care aide, and a Black male nurse. I may have neglected to say that. And she reported to Dr. Para that the police would harass him, pull him over on his way to her house and ask him what he was doing in the neighborhood, and that, this was just beginning to be untenable. And so he grabbed another church member, and he worked it out with the Black male nurse to ride in the back seat of his car as he drove over to his client's house. And when the police pulled him over, George got out, took their pictures, and said, "I'm going to send this to the Alexandria Gazette and report what you're doing to this man." And according to George, that was the end of the harassment, but he and Nancy got some nasty phone calls after that. But anyway, George liked to be personally involved in the organizations that Westminster supported financially. He liked to be working in the trenches with Alive and with the senior services and other organizations. And he also worked behind the scenes with local Black leaders, some of those that Connie introduced to him, and some of those that Albert Ransom, who was a Black Baptist preacher who attended Westminster some in the 1980s. So he did also cultivate some of those relationships. He also established a discussion group with about 24 members of Westminster and Alfred Street Baptist Church. Candace and Henry Rush were actually part of this discussion group, and Candace told me that that she thought that by getting together on a regular basis, they hoped that this would lead to a place where they could have more comfortable conversations, especially about areas of differences between them. And she felt like that for the most part, they had accomplished that. So as I finish up today's presentation, I wanted to look back on Westminster's record and from sort of a wide angle view. And what I can say based on what I've been able to learn from our archives and from other research and from talking to people is that that there's no evidence that points to any exclusion of anyone from the church. The evidence points to inclusion. So the conclusion that I can draw is that ostensibly Westminster has always been welcoming to all, but as we all know, has attracted only a small number of Blacks over the years. Westminster has been a church whose members are called to public service and to community involvement. Pastors who open up the dialogue, lead by example, like to roll up their sleeves and be a part of what the church is doing. It's a congregation that tends to work behind the scenes to enact change, sort of what I might call a quiet activism. One exception to that is our efforts in Moyes Bridge, Kenya, to found and maintain and grow the United Orphanage and Academy. And then another trend that I would point to in Westminster's record is a shift from mission funding that is centralized through the Presbyterian Church and through funds that are distributed by the Presbyterian Church into other areas, shifting from that sort of model to more of a local congregation-led model of mission funding. And to conclude, I just wanted to share this quote with you from Martin Luther King, who, based on my study, I think is also a quote that could have been said by Cliff Johnson when he was preaching. It's very similar to things that he said in some of his sermons. There comes a time when one must take a position that is neither safe nor politic nor popular, but he must take it because conscience tells him it is right. And that concludes my presentation. And I would love to try to answer your questions.
Thank you, Melynda. So I don't mind calling on people. And I think I'll start in the room first just to see if any comments or questions. Jane, you want to come up here and be seen?
No,
you don't? All right. All right. Anyway. So Donald, do you have any questions or comments?
I did. First, thanks, Melynda, for the great presentation. It's always, when we talked about this in the Therefore Committee, that you were going to do this. For me, it's always the fear of what you would find, and then when you told us you were getting close to being done, it was the girding myself for, okay, how am I going to forgive this person? and there wasn't any of that. You found joy and all these other things. So I was very thankful and happy to hear all about that. My one question, like the question I had, well, I guess to the freedom of the pulpit, at that time, was that not common? So that's my first question. And then the second one was just, how did you find anything about what the session thought? Was there any debates within the session of, should we keep Pastor Johnson here or not, based on his preaching?
So those are great questions. The first question about freedom of the pulpit. There, you might recall from my first presentation, I talked about how he said in one of his sermons that he had seminary colleagues, fellow seminary students who did not have the freedom of the pulpit that he had, and he was very grateful for that. And when I talked to Winky Campbell about Don Campbell, she said that even in the 70s, when he was at Westminster, that even he was grateful for what he thought was the freedom to the freedom of the pulpit, because even at that time, there were people that he knew who could not support integration from the pulpit the way he could. And so that was really remarkable to me. I mean, you've got Cliff Johnson saying this in the 50s and 60s, which is, this is one thing, but to have Don Campbell, saying that in the 1970s. So absolutely, there were ministers who could have lost their pulpits if they showed support for integration.
Yeah, Melynda, I might just chime in on that too, if I'm on here. Freedom of the pulpit has always been something that's pretty built into Presbyterianism, but that doesn't mean it. It also means the freedom to get fired. Okay, and that was not uncommon. I mean, I grew up with kids. I knew a couple of kids whose fathers at that time were, lost their jobs, and new ministers. I knew ministers who had lost their jobs. Some of them are still young enough to be alive, but that was not uncommon. It also sounds like, given what Melynda's found about the sort of history of open membership here, that would have reflected the direction the Presbyterian Church in the South was going in about the time Westminster was founded, but it would have put us on the more open end for that period. Jane, yeah.
In 1960, though, there was a big question about the probability of a Catholic being elected president.
Yeah.
And Cliff said, I will not discuss this from a bully pulpit, but if you want to hear my views, come to Fellowship Hall tonight and I'll tell you what I feel.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And what did he say?
Well, he was concerned.
Yeah.
He wasn't against it, but he was concerned that the Catholic Church had a great deal of pressure on anyone.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons he supported the Supreme Court decision to ban school-sponsored prayer was because he didn't want students to have to say Catholic prayers.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, he wasn't a big fan of Catholicism, but
So Melynda, Donald, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
Donald asked a second question too.
The rest of your question about what you can see from, what the session debated. Well, anybody who's on here who's been a clerk of the session probably knows that there's not a lot in the session minutes about the debate. There's information about what action was taken or action that was not taken. So it's a little bit of kind of trying to read through the lines, which is what I've sort of done with some of those session actions that I put on a timeline, because there's not a lot of information about who was concerned about this and who was concerned about that. There's it appears that the instance that I showed that that the session voted to affirm its policy of welcoming anybody into the church into membership. It appears that was, and this is not in the session minutes, this is from other information that I've gathered, that a member pressed the session on the question and the session had to respond. But there's nothing in the session minutes that sort of give you the background to that. And I've pored over pages and pages of session minutes, and it's there's just not a lot there to really sink your teeth into. It's just, unfortunately, but thank you for asking the question.
Thank you.
Other questions? Yeah, Patrick?
What happened?
Nothing.
Patrick, do you want to go ahead and then?
I do,
Sid,
yeah. I
I'll
just didn't want
recognize
to. I didn't
you.
want to cut off somebody who's in the room. Have we ever identified when and who would have been the first African American to be a member of Westminster? And I forget if you've answered that before. And then the second part was my ears perked up about that associate pastor and his report. Can you remind me again? Was that during Don Campbell's tenure?
Cliff Johnson, he was John Watkins was it's sort of an interesting story about him. He was associate pastor. He had told Cliff that he wanted to start looking for a church of his own. And that was just a couple of months before Cliff Johnson died. And so they were able to convince John Watkins to stay on a little bit longer before he then left to take a church in North Carolina. But yeah, he was there. I think he probably was there for most of the 1960s.
This business about losing a pastorate, though, is not hypothetical. I mean, didn't Jim Muskin's father lose a pastorate, Larry, as I recall?
Who's that?
Jim's father, Jim Muskin.
Yeah, Jim Myskins, and that was in Minnesota. Oh, maybe about this period. And I don't think it was more dealing with immigration issues and labor issues in Minnesota, as I recall. Yeah.
I don't know.
Madeline has her
who
hand
the
raised.
First African-American member was, but I know that in early 1969, Nixon brought a couple from California the guy was to be in Nixon's cabinet, and they joined Westminster, both in the choir, and she sang. I accompanied her several times. They were wonderful people. But they could be the first Black members, but I'm not sure.
Okay.
There is an anecdote of a Black couple visiting Westminster in the early 60s that was a recollection of one of Cliff Johnson's sons, Sam. So I suspect that there were visitors, and I know that there were some members starting in 1970s, and those that Jane referred to might have been some of the very earliest. Madeline has her hand raised.
Yeah,
and
let me recognize. I said I'd recognize Sig and then Madeline after that. Okay. So Sig's had his hand up, his real hand up.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Larry. There's too many things here that I've written down. I think, first of all, we have seen in my lifetime, I came to the United States at the age of 12, at the Christmas of 1951. And I've seen just dramatic change in racial improvement in racial relations in the United States. I having been educated from 12 on through graduate school in New York City, there were some, I had mixed race people at every grade level, and especially in college in ROTC, and I served with many people from around the country of various, all the races. So I also was in a church in Darien, Connecticut, where we stopped trying to do the politically correct thing to go visit once a year down in Harlem to a church. and instead, our pastor led us to go within 3 miles of our church to Stamford and the other town, to visit the poor and of all races and help them and so forth and so on. So I'm encouraged to hear that a lot of work has been done by various pastors and other people, and especially Connie, to reach out to African-American pastors in Alexandria, because I believe that the main work of the church is the people that you live around. So, you know, it's we have a whole battle between the secular society and the true church, and then all the others who are fake Christians, you know, because they don't follow the scriptures. So I guess that's I encourage us, our congregation, to reach out more to the local pastors, and also to interview the people of African descent who have been recently in Westminster and why they came and to worship at Westminster.
Okay.
And also there's a huge problem of where many people want to worship with people of their own kind. I've gotten this from many people of African descent, from the Caribbean, from Africa, from you know, the United States, et cetera, et cetera. You know, so the issue is not about, you know, statistics. It's about following the gospel and about the Acts of the Apostles and what Jesus said and so forth.
Okay, thank you, Sig. Madeline?
It's really not germane to racism, but I wanted to elaborate a little bit on what Melynda said about mission funding, although I think Jane could do it better than I. Under Cliff, there were special offerings taken for a number of things, and some people liked it and some people didn't. And when Don Campbell came, he believed that when we took up any special offering, that we decreased what people would put in their pledge, and that they should put it all in the pledge, and the session should make all the decisions about where it went, whether through the Presbyterian General Assembly or whether locally, that it would be determined by session alone. And so for a great period, we had something called a unified budget, and there were no special offerings. When George Perry came, then we began to loosen a little and continued up to this day. And I believe it's a very good thing. I think people do like to chase particular causes, and it does not take away from their pledging. So I think it's good that we have reversed that trend.
And I would add, just to add to that part of Melynda's presentation, it was much more common in the 40s, 50s, 60s, even through the 70s, for most of your mission giving to occur through Presbyterian General Assembly and Synod. And actually, Presbyterians had a lot of programs in those days. The pattern towards localism, which is where we are now, where congregations sponsor major mission programs, has been developing over about the last 30 or 40 years. And Westminster would be typical, more typical in the denomination too. So thank you, Madeline. Are there other questions? Did you have another one? Okay. Or comments? I can only see about a third of you on the screen at this point. So you.
And I would just add on the giving, in the early days of the church, I'm talking about the 40s and 50s mostly, there was not very much money given outside the church, even through the denominational funds, because they were having not an easy time coming up with the money to do all of the construction and pay all the bills. There were a number of times when Cliff Johnson would say during the service, you got to dig a little deeper. So I just don't think that it was, I mean, I don't want to, this is not a negative thing. It just wasn't a high priority of theirs at that time, because they were growing their church, and the church was growing. And in terms of pushback on session taking action against things that Cliff was saying. I think the proof was in the pudding. He was filling the church with people, and the church was growing like gangbusters. And so I'm not, I am positive that there were individual people who didn't like what Cliff had to say, but by and large, there doesn't seem to be any effort of people voting with their feet to leave the church.
Larry, can I just offer one comment as
Sure.
First gentleman for this, for purposes of this evening? I think, like all great research, this body of research that Melynda's done leaves us with as many challenging questions to ask as it answers. I think there's a lot of hard questions here that are left unanswered. Lots of challenges for us today, lots of tough issues for us to wrestle with as a congregation based on our legacy. So I will say unequivocally, I'm very proud of the research that's been done here. It doesn't close the chapter on what Westminster will stand for.
Thank you. Other comments?
I have a question. Has there been or will there be a teaching series covering race relations from Genesis through Revelation?
Well,
You gotta take
I
the
guess,
class,
sorry.
Big.
So Larry did something last fall on what the Bible has to say about slavery. Is that kind of what you're referring to, Sig, or?
Well, okay, I don't know when that was presented. I don't know if I missed it or if I was in choir, which I can't go to adult education
Right.
when I'm in choir. So I'll have to see if it's recorded. I'd love to check on it to see what the content is, because there's some wonderful teaching by major African-American pastors who are truly Bible-driven, Bible-centric, who put the whole context based on original sin. And if you don't start there, you don't really know what you're doing and why you're doing it. For instance, in the African American community, there are segments, and they're true Bible-centric believers who are not doing the yelling and screaming. It's more secular humanists who are doing the yelling and screaming, and so you have to question motives. And we know what the God teaches us, and it's all in the gospel. It's from in the whole book. Moses was married to an African, and so forth and so on. You have the Acts of the Apostles, where if you worship God, you had thousands of people worshiping God of every race that was known at that time. So it's if you really understand the scriptures, then you know what you should be doing, and so.
Okay, thank you.
As a Christian.
I just wanted to mention that Jacob in the chat has posted the link to the October 10th presentation, which covers Cliff Johnson and the early part of the church. So if you want to go back and look at that, the link is there. You can copy and paste it for use later.
Nancy Hall Behrens.
Hi, Melynda, I didn't know if it was premature to mention that you're doing a written report as well, because I had the privilege of reading that before tonight. And frankly, I mean, there's a lot there's just so much. And even if you attend tonight, I would encourage you to read the report when it does come out, because you'll hear more anecdotes and more information.
I didn't pay Nancy to do that.
No, it really is.
Yeah,
good.
right,
I mean,
right.
Donald's seen it. And some others have
Yeah,
seen
I did. I have shared it with a few people for some early comments, and I'm still working on it. There are a couple more things that I want to add. There's one key person that I'm still need to interview yet, and a couple of sidebars that I want to write. So I would guess it's probably going to be available around Easter, and it will be available. I'm not exact. We haven't really talked about how it will be made available, but it will absolutely be made available. It's about 40 pages, so it's not. You can use it as a doorstop, or you can. It's very comprehensive. And it has
really
a lot. It has a lot of excerpts from Cliff Johnson's sermons, as well as other anecdotes and interesting things about our church history. So,
yes, it's very good. So, I think with that, Melynda, did you have a closing prayer, or would you like me to call on somebody else to do that?
I did not have a closing prayer,
Okay.
but
I will. Patrick just lifted his hand,
and
he has come out of Duke grief and is now ready to play.
Come on, Jane. We're going to get him back. We're going to get him back, Jane. And I'm partly raising my hand, and I promise Nancy Hall Barons did not pay me to make this announcement, but I want to say that tomorrow at noon, we have a great Broadening Horizons event with our political trio, Matt Visor and Dan Judy, and John McCardle, and who am I missing? That's it. That's it.
Yeah, trio is 3 people, so that's
those
good.
3, right? Exactly. So that's tomorrow at noon, to build on our awareness of our political situation and where we are as a people. So, thank you all, Melynda. Thank you. That was awesome. I put in a request for that associate pastor report. So if you have a copy of that, I'd like.
I do. I've got it with me here, so I'll get it to you when I get back. So.
Okay, thanks. Let us pray. Lord, as this Sunday comes to a close, in which we have worshiped in a rhythm of seeking your mercy and hearing of your love, of sitting in silence, and by music and word, attending to those moments in Scripture and in life where your people have both strayed but have been redeemed and returned. And so with that in mind, we give thanks for the telling of this story and for the voices that have so richly informed it. And we honor the memory of Connie Ring and others in our church who lived lives of service and have shown us a way forward. And we ask that what we're doing here would honor that work, would indeed add to the legacy and help us to, as David alludes, address and face the questions that we have before us, confident in your Spirit's direction and leading, and most importantly, its advocacy, not just on our behalf, but on behalf of those whom you love and you call us to love too. We could say so much more, but we will end by saying, Amen.
Amen. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much to Melynda and to all of you all for being on. And some of you will be the next program because you're going to the civil rights pilgrimage, and a week later we're going to report back. So
yeah,
keep your ears and eyes open. So thank you, Melynda.
Thank you all so much for your interest.
Thank you,
Well
Melynda.
done, Melynda. Well done.
Donald, I looked at it.